NBC Studios, Burbank. October 12, 1956. The Dean Martin Show is preparing for what network executives believe will be one of their biggest episodes ever. In one corner, Dean Martin, the smooth crooner who represents everything sophisticated and timeless about American entertainment. In the other, Elvis Presley, the 21-year-old phenomenon who has been turning the music world upside down for the past 18 months. The plan is simple. America's smoothest entertainer will welcome rock and roll's most controversial star. They'll perform a duet that bridges the generation gap, and television history will be made. But as Elvis walks into the studio for rehearsal, Dean Martin takes one look at the young man with the slicked hair and rebellious sneer and makes a decision that will shock everyone present and create one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. "I'm not singing with him," Dean tells producer Greg Garrison, loud enough for Elvis to hear. "This rock and roll thing is just a fad. I'm not going to embarrass myself performing with some kid who'll be forgotten in 6 months." What happens next will reveal the bitter divide between old Hollywood sophistication and the new energy of rock and roll, create one of the most awkward television appearances ever filmed, and ultimately prove which generation truly understood what American audiences wanted. This is the story of the night Dean Martin tried to humiliate Elvis Presley on national television and how his plan backfired in the most spectacular way possible. To understand the magnitude of the insult Dean Martin delivered, you have to understand what each man represented in 1956 American entertainment. Dean Martin wasn't just a singer, he was the embodiment of cool, sophisticated masculinity that had defined American popular culture for decades. As half of the legendary comedy duo Martin and Lewis, and later as a solo performer, Dean had established himself as the ultimate smooth operator. His relaxed vocal style, impeccable timing, and effortless charisma made him the standard by which all male entertainers were measured. When Dean Martin walked onto a stage, he carried with him the weight of traditional American show business at its most polished and professional. Elvis Presley, by contrast, represented everything that threatened Dean's world. The young man from Memphis didn't just sing differently. He moved differently, looked different, and connected with audiences in ways that bypassed the sophisticated entertainment traditions that Dean had mastered. More troubling to established entertainers like Dean was that Elvis's success suggested that American audiences might be ready to abandon the sophisticated entertainment they had been raised on in favor of something raw, immediate, and dangerously uncontrolled. The invitation for Elvis to appear on the Dean Martin Show came from NBC executives who recognized that the network needed to acknowledge the rock and roll phenomenon that was dominating record sales and driving teenage audiences wild. But they also wanted to manage that acknowledgement carefully, using Dean Martin's sophisticated presence to tame Elvis's rebellious energy. The plan was for Dean to serve as a kind of entertainment ambassador, welcoming Elvis into the fold of legitimate show business while demonstrating that rock and roll could coexist with traditional entertainment values. The duet they planned, a medley that would blend Dean's smooth crooning with Elvis's energetic style, was designed to show America that the generation gap could be bridged through music. But Dean Martin had other ideas. From the moment Elvis arrived at NBC Studios, Dean's hostility was obvious to everyone present. While crew members and other guests were excited to meet the young sensation, Dean remained aloof and dismissive, treating Elvis like an unwelcome intruder rather than a fellow performer. Dean was making it clear that he considered Elvis beneath his notice, recalled backup singer Janet Blair, who witnessed the rehearsals. He wouldn't look at Elvis directly, wouldn't acknowledge his presence, and kept making comments about amateurs and fads loud enough for everyone to hear. The tension reached its peak when producer Greg Garrison tried to rehearse the planned duet. Dean listened to the arrangement for about 30 seconds, then stopped the music with a wave of his hand. "This isn't going to work," Dean announced to the room. "I've built a career on quality entertainment, and I'm not going to throw it away for some publicity stunt. Find something else for the kid to do." The use of the word kid was particularly insulting. Elvis was 21 years old and had already sold millions of records, but Dean's dismissive language was designed to diminish his status and make him seem like a novelty act rather than a serious performer. Elvis's reaction to Dean's insult revealed the class and professionalism that would define his entire career. Instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, Elvis simply nodded and said, "I understand, Mr. Martin, whatever you think is best." The respectful response seemed to irritate Dean even more. He had expected Elvis to react with the kind of juvenile behavior that would confirm his prejudices about rock and roll performers. Instead, he was dealing with a young man who showed more grace under pressure than many established entertainers. Elvis was handling the situation better than Dean was, observed guitarist Scotty Moore, who had accompanied Elvis to the taping. Dean was the one acting unprofessional, but Elvis just kept being polite and respectful. It made Dean look petty by comparison. With the duet cancelled, the show's format had to be quickly restructured. Instead of the collaborative performance that was supposed to demonstrate musical unity, Elvis would perform alone while Dean would limit his interaction to a brief introduction and closing remarks. But Dean's humiliation of Elvis wasn't finished. During the actual taping, Dean's introduction of Elvis was so unenthusiastic and dismissive that it bordered on insulting. "Well, we've got this young fellow here who's been making quite a stir with the teenagers," Dean said with barely concealed contempt. "Let's see what all the fuss is about. Here's Elvis Presley." The introduction was so obviously dismissive that the studio audience immediately sensed the tension. Instead of the warm welcome that guests typically received on variety shows, Elvis was walking onto a stage where the host had essentially announced that he didn't belong there. But if Dean expected Elvis to be intimidated or diminished by the hostile reception, he had seriously underestimated the young performer's abilities and determination. Elvis's performance that night was nothing short of spectacular. Singing "Don't Be Cruel" and "Love Me Tender," he delivered two songs with such charisma, vocal power, and stage presence that the studio audience forgot all about Dean's dismissive introduction and responded with the kind of enthusiasm that made television history. The contrast between Dean's cool professionalism and Elvis's raw energy was stark, but it wasn't the contrast Dean had intended to highlight. Instead of making Elvis look amateurish, the comparison made Dean's style seem stiff and outdated. You could see the audience responding to Elvis in a way they never responded to Dean, remembered audience member Patricia Wilson, who was 18 at the time. Dean was smooth and professional, but Elvis was electric. He made you feel something. The most telling moment came during Elvis's performance of "Love Me Tender." The song's gentle melody and romantic lyrics allowed Elvis to demonstrate that his appeal wasn't just about rebellious energy. He could also deliver emotional nuance and vocal sophistication that rivaled any traditional crooner. As Elvis sang, cameras occasionally cut to Dean Martin in the wings, and his expression told the story of the evening. The confident dismissiveness he had shown during rehearsals was gradually replaced by something that looked suspiciously like recognition and perhaps even concern. Dean was watching Elvis win over an audience with the kind of effortless connection that no amount of professional training could teach. The fad he had dismissed was demonstrating staying power and artistic merit that demanded to be taken seriously. The audience response to Elvis's performance was overwhelming. The applause was longer and more enthusiastic than anything Dean typically received on his own show, and the energy in the studio had completely shifted from Dean's sophisticated cool to Elvis's electric warmth. When Elvis finished performing and Dean returned to the stage for his closing remarks, the awkwardness was palpable. Dean had planned to end the show with some dismissive comment that would put Elvis back in his place, but the audience's obvious enthusiasm made that impossible. Instead, Dean offered a grudging acknowledgement that barely qualified as professional courtesy. "Well, that was interesting. Thank you, Elvis." It was perhaps the most lukewarm praise ever given to a performer who had just electrified a television audience. But even that minimal acknowledgement represented a retreat from Dean's earlier hostility. The show aired on October 15, 1956, and the audience response was immediate and overwhelming. NBC was flooded with calls from viewers who wanted to know when Elvis would be back, while Dean's regular fan mail decreased noticeably. More importantly, the contrast between Dean's dismissive attitude and Elvis's gracious professionalism became a major topic of discussion in entertainment circles and the press. Dean, who had intended to use his show to diminish Elvis's status, had instead created a public relations disaster for himself. "Dean came across as petty and jealous," wrote television critic John Crosby. "Elvis handled himself with class and dignity while delivering a performance that made you understand why young people are abandoning the old crooners in favor of this new sound." The episode became a defining moment in the transition from traditional pop entertainment to rock and roll. Dean Martin's attempt to preserve old Hollywood values by dismissing Elvis had backfired spectacularly, proving that audiences were ready for the energy and authenticity that Elvis represented. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Dean's snub was its effect on Elvis himself. The experience of being professionally humiliated on national television, then triumphing through the quality of his performance, gave Elvis a confidence and determination that would serve him throughout his career. That night taught Elvis that he didn't need the approval of the establishment, observed biographer Peter Guralnick. He learned that he could succeed on his own terms, and that his connection with audiences was stronger than any criticism from traditional entertainers. In the months following the Dean Martin Show appearance, Elvis's career exploded to even greater heights. He signed with RCA, appeared on Ed Sullivan, and became the biggest star in American entertainment. Meanwhile, Dean Martin's career, while still successful, began to seem increasingly dated and irrelevant to younger audiences. The irony was that Dean's attempt to protect traditional entertainment values by dismissing Elvis had actually accelerated the very changes he was trying to prevent. By creating such an obvious contrast between old and new approaches to performance, Dean had inadvertently demonstrated why Elvis's style was more appealing to contemporary audiences. Years later, Dean Martin would privately acknowledge his mistake. In a 1969 interview, he admitted, "I was wrong about Elvis. I thought he was just another flash in the pan, but he turned out to have real talent and staying power. I should have been more professional that night." But the damage to Dean's reputation had been lasting. The Dean Martin Show incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing new talent out of professional jealousy or generational prejudice. For Elvis, the experience became part of the mythology that surrounded his rise to fame. The story of how he maintained his dignity and professionalism in the face of deliberate humiliation, then won over audiences through the power of his performance, became emblematic of his character and his approach to his career. The night when Dean Martin refused to sing with Elvis Presley became a symbol of the changing of the guard in American entertainment. The smooth sophistication of the 1940s and 1950s was giving way to the raw energy of rock and roll, and no amount of professional dismissiveness could stop that transformation. In the end, Dean Martin's snub of Elvis Presley revealed more about Dean than it did about Elvis. It showed an established star so threatened by new talent that he abandoned his own professionalism in a futile attempt to maintain his relevance. Elvis, meanwhile, demonstrated the grace under pressure and commitment to excellence that would define his entire career. He had been insulted on national television by one of America's biggest stars, but he responded by delivering a performance so powerful that it made his critic look petty and outdated. The king of rock and roll had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better than the people who try to tear you down. Dean Martin wanted to prove that Elvis was just a fad. Instead, he proved that dismissing talent out of fear and jealousy is the real mistake that doesn't last. The night Elvis was snubbed on the Dean Martin Show became the night he proved he didn't need anyone's permission to be great.